of the work that's been done, to Bob's point, over the last 5 or 6 months to update your natural hazards mitigation plan. We also want to hear from you to ensure we're accounting for what matters most to you, the public, the residents of McHenry County. Quick note that the county's mitigation committee, which is comprised of representatives from the county and all municipalities and townships, have been meeting monthly since November of last year to advance this important work of updating the plan. And to that, I just want to say thank you to those members that are joining us today for their commitments and their hard work. All right. So we understand the purpose of today's meeting. So how are we going to achieve it, right? So we're going to do a few things. We want to make sure that you've got clear line of sight around what FEMA's hazard mitigation planning process and requirements are, including how we intend to satisfy those requirements. We're also going to review the county's progress to date, which is going to include, as Bob mentioned earlier, the results of the 2023 Natural Hazards Public Survey that some of you may have taken, and how those results influence the results of our risk assessment. Finally, again, we want to hear from you. So we've dedicated the last 20 so minutes of the meeting to address any of your questions and comments. Okay. Now, before jumping in to our first presentation, we thought it was really important to take a minute and provide some context around some of the words you're going to be hearing consistently throughout the presentation, right? So first and foremost, what are natural hazards? Well, natural hazards are defined as environmental phenomena that have the potential to impact societies and the human environment. So these shouldn't be confused with other types of hazards, such as man-made hazards. So for example, a flood resulting from changes in river flows is a natural hazard, whereas flooding due to a dam failure is considered a man-made hazard. So just want to make that clear. Now, mitigation is the effort taken to reduce the loss of life and property by lessening the impact of disaster events, in this case, natural hazards disaster events. So these are things like elevating a home above base flood elevation to lessen the impacts of future flooding events. Finally, resilience, which is a word I feel like we hear constantly throughout our day, is really the capacity of individuals, communities, businesses, institutions, governments to adapt to changing conditions and prepare for, withstand, and rapidly recover from disruptions, including disaster events. Okay. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Kelly Reddick, who's going to provide us with an overview of FEMA's hazard mitigation process. So with that, Kelly, take it away.
Thank you. And you can go ahead to the next slide. So it's great to meet everyone. Again, we've had the pleasure of working with McHenry County and all of the lovely townships, municipalities on this plan update. And it's just been a real great process. So glad to be helping to tie this plan all together. So we'll just do a little bit of a refresh on hazard mitigation and what hazard mitigation planning is. So as Justin said, hazard mitigation refers to really any action that eliminates or reduces risk to life and property from natural disasters. So hazard mitigation kind of breaks that cycle of disaster damage and repair by actually preventing damage to homes, to businesses, to community facilities, and to infrastructure. And hazard mitigation can include both policy updates as well as construction projects. So as Bob mentioned in the intro, FEMA actually requires states and local governments to have hazard mitigation plans in order to be eligible for grant assistance. These plans have to be updated every 5 years in order to maintain that eligibility. But really the purpose of the Natural Hazard Mitigation Plan is to develop a long-term strategy to reduce disaster damage, community disruption, and repetitive loss impacts. It has a lot more value than just unlocking the ability to pursue FEMA grants. And a really good way to think about mitigation is that it is an investment. So studies show that on average, every dollar spent on mitigation saves about $6 in future disaster losses. And this really demonstrates that hazard mitigation activities reduce those future costs associated with disaster response and recovery. So for McHenry County's hazard mitigation plan update, we really focus on regional collaboration and relationship building between the county, the townships, the cities, and the towns. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here's some examples of different types of hazard mitigation projects. These activities are known to reduce risk and are also eligible for grant funding from FEMA. So, and I'm not going to read through this list, just give you some examples. So flood protection and home retrofits are common hazard mitigation activities, including structure elevations, floodproofing, and even acquisition and demolition projects, which have been, recently executed within the county. There's also stormwater control and stream restoration, which support better drainage. Those are also good mitigation projects. And then you can even see that, emergency power projects are good mitigation, including providing generators for critical facilities. And then there's also things like utility protection, hardening against winter storms. These are very applicable types of hazard mitigation projects to McHenry County, in addition to storm shelters and safe rooms. Next slide, please. So FEMA actually has a prescribed hazard mitigation planning process, and it's actually codified into law. So McHenry County has to make sure it's following FEMA's defined process in order to update its plan. And this process can be summarized into really 4 primary steps. So the first step is organizing the planning process and resources. So McHenry County created a planning team and a mitigation committee, which includes all participating jurisdictions, to really drive the plan update and provide data for that update. So this is where that public survey comes into play. We use that public survey as a tool to gain the public's understanding and knowledge of natural hazards and which natural hazards present the greatest threat to the community. So the second step is to assess risks and capabilities. So a natural hazard risk assessment is really the driving force behind the hazard mitigation plan. It identifies which threats present the greatest harm to McHenry County communities. So that way a mitigation strategy can be developed to address those priority risks. And so today, through the rest of this presentation, we'll walk through the results of our preliminary risk assessment for your feedback. And then the third step is developing that mitigation strategy, right? Which is what the mitigation committee and the planning team are working on right now. The mitigation strategy is really what we call the heart of the mitigation plan. This is where the county evaluates its goals, objectives, and actions to address the threats that are identified in the risk assessment. This mitigation strategy also contains an action plan, which includes clear identified next steps, a schedule of activities, and different responsible communities. Then lastly, the plan, once it's drafted and reviewed by the community, will be sent to the Illinois Emergency Management Agency, or IEMA, for an initial review to make sure the plan meets all FEMA requirements. The plan will then be sent to FEMA for review, and once the plan is reviewed and approved by FEMA, then McHenry County and participating jurisdictions have to formally adopt the plan in order to remain eligible for that FEMA federal assistance. So again, the planning team and the mitigation committee is using this meeting to get public feedback on the risk assessment update and is working towards developing that mitigation strategy, which will be presented next month. Next slide, please. All right, so really quickly on organizational roles and responsibilities, we did go over this briefly just now, but just as a recap. So the hazard mitigation planning process is somewhat of a partnership with McHenry County, IEMA, and FEMA. And so as I noted before, McHenry County is really responsible for developing and updating and maintaining the multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan. Once this update is complete, McHenry County will submit the plan to IEMA, who will conduct an initial plan review once the draft is submitted. Then IEMA will pass the plan to FEMA, who will conduct the final plan review and will approve the plan. And then lastly, again, McHenry County will formally adopt the plan and coordinate with all of its jurisdictions to formally adopt the plan. Next slide, please. So this might be a little tough to see, but essentially here's the process and the schedule for McHenry County's hazard mitigation plan update. So we're here at our first public meeting to obtain feedback on the county's risk assessment. And as I said before, next month we will host another public meeting to get feedback on the goals, objectives, and actions that are being updated for the plan. And our goal is to submit the plan to IEMA by June 9th. This hopefully provides sufficient time for IEMA and FEMA review processes, with the goal to hopefully have an approval by September, and have the county and its jurisdictions adopt the plan by November. These are totally projections on the schedule. IEMA and FEMA's review process is really dependent on their review of the plan and if they want us to make any adjustments. But the goal is to hopefully have the plan adopted by the county and its municipalities prior to those FEMA Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grants being due next January. And for those of you who haven't heard of the FEMA Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Grant, or BRIC program, this is FEMA's annual non-disaster grant program that has had significant amounts of funding to improve infrastructure and implement hazard mitigation projects throughout the nation. And I think at this point, unless there are any questions, back to you, Justin.
All right, thank you so much, Kelly. So an important element of the risk assessment was certainly your input. All right, so we want to take a minute to share some of the feedback that we'd received as part of the survey. So for some backgrounds, in February of this year, the county broadcast a survey through their .gov website, some recurring newsletters, and social media channels, including, let's see, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Nextdoor, to name a few, to really understand the residents' perceptions of their natural hazards risks, their levels of preparedness, and then really what their safety and security priorities are. Additionally, several municipalities and townships actually broadcast this messaging via their own websites and newsletters and social media accounts. So this was truly a county-wide effort. And to Bob's point earlier, as a result, the county received over 640 total unique responses, which is an increase of over 450 responses since the previous survey back in 2016. So this was quite an accomplishment and really underscores the power of partnerships and really just meeting people where they are, where they already are, using the tools and the venues that folks are already leveraging in their everyday lives. So what does that 640 total responses look like? So here's a breakdown of how those responses were distributed across the county. On the left side of the screen, you can see an overwhelming majority of responses came from Algonquin and McHenry townships. And on the right side of the screen here, you can see that that all municipalities were represented, or almost all rather. With the majority of responses coming from the village of Johnsburg, way to go. Then a smattering of others that are all highlighted there for you. Note, we also received over 40 responses from residents in unincorporated areas of the county as well. So truly representative of the entire county here. All right, now on to the results. So in regards to lived experience, over half of respondents, so about 54%, told us that they'd experienced a natural disaster event in McHenry County. Of those, an overwhelming majority said they'd experienced either severe winter storms, right? So extreme cold, ice, and snow, and severe winter storms, things like microbursts, hail, lightning, high winds. We also acknowledge that there could have been some questions about what experienced means, which may have lowered the percentage a bit. And so we're going to document that for next time. In regards to perception of risk, tornadoes were identified far and away as the natural hazard that posed the greatest threat to their community. Despite only 12% of residents telling us they had experienced one in McHenry County. Assuming the quick and devastating impacts of tornadoes versus a bit of a slower burn of some of these other threats may have factored into the results here. The next closest perceived threats were in line with the ones respondents told us they'd had the most experience with. Again, severe winter storms and severe summer storms. In regards to preparedness, 70% of respondents felt their communities doing a good or fair job at making them aware of their natural hazards risks. Now, I want to preface that by saying a little over half felt only somewhat prepared for natural hazards versus around 12% that felt very well or well prepared. So we'd love to see those numbers increase in the near term. Also, 77% of respondents told us they didn't know who to contact to learn more about natural hazards risks in their community. We also identified that over 77% of respondents do not have flood insurance or had not purchased flood insurance. And this was largely due to most folks not living in a floodplain or their homes were elevated to mitigate the impacts of flooding. Now, all that to say, an overwhelming majority confirmed that they are interested in learning more and making their homes more resistant to the impacts of natural disasters, which is a very nice segue into priorities and preferences. So, a couple of things that we weren't surprised by. We found that most folks had the basic necessities of safety in their homes, things like extra food, extra water, flashlights, batteries, medical supplies, first aid kits, and fire extinguishers. Also, unsurprisingly, we found that respondents prioritized the protection of lives and critical life-saving and sustaining functions like emergency services and basic utilities. Now, overwhelmingly, email and text were the preferred methods for receiving information about natural hazards, followed by information on county or community websites at about 12%. Now, the most popular ideas for mitigation projects, and we received a lot of ideas and general feedback through this process. So some of the most popular ideas for those projects were conducting exercises, scenario-based exercises to really test emergency response procedures to enhance preparedness when disaster strikes, right? Also, a lot of interest in establishing a volunteer network, sort of a community emergency response team that would help supplement local post-disaster recovery efforts. Additionally, and not surprising, kind of a nice complement to wanting to learn more was just improving digital communication to enhance accessibility and the speed with which people receive information about natural hazards preparedness and emergency response. A lot of folks were referencing those NIXL alerts. I know that we're very prominent over the last few years as a potential best practice to consider for the future. And then lastly, increasing investment in water and land-based conservation efforts, a way to bolster natural defenses against natural hazards impacts. Okay. And then finally here, the most common piece of feedback we received was just requesting more information on natural hazards preparedness and emergency operations procedures so folks can feel better equipped to respond when disaster strikes. Again, if you recall, this is very consistent with that desire to increase awareness and understanding of how to be better prepared when disaster strikes. So all that to say, the county looked at this data and took it into under important consideration as we stepped through a more rigid risk assessment process. So with that, I'm going to pass it back over to my colleague Kelly to talk to us about that risk assessment process and some of those results.
Thank you. All right, so this is going to be the fun part. Let's talk about the risk assessment update for McHenry County. So before we get started, I do want to note that we have reviewed and received a ton of resources from the county and from its jurisdictions to update the risk assessment, including the McHenry County 2021 Threats and Hazards Assessment, data that is being used for the 2050 Comprehensive Plan update, the Water Resources Action Plan, and the Fox River Corridor Plan. Next slide, please. So from this planning documentation, we have McHenry County community profile and examine the changes that have been experienced by the community since 2017. At a high level, the population growth has tapered since the last plan update, which most communities are seeing as a result of the pandemic. However, CMAP still projects that there's going to be significant population growth by 2050 to potentially over 478,000 residents. In addition, approximately 4,000 housing units have been added since 2017, which is modest growth, but there are still challenges with affordable housing, and many residents have noted the need for different housing options. Currently, the housing stock remains primarily owner-occupied and single-family homes. The county's also seen an increase in the number of residents who may travel outside the county for employment, which really makes the reliance on roads and regional highways more important for residents' financial well-being, which should be considered in a risk assessment. And manufacturing and retail trade industries continue to be the largest employment sectors in the county. And lastly, the county continues to remain mostly agricultural in its land use. However, significant acreage of farmland may be developed by 2040 to meet growth projections, potentially in areas south of Marengo and Union. And again, this is important from a hazard mitigation perspective to understand how development might change things like drainage capabilities, and how that might potentially, contribute to increased risk. Next slide, please. And from a hazard profile perspective, the team conducted research to identify new occurrences of hazard events from the last plan update. So as most of us here know, presidential disaster declarations are rare for McHenry County. However, that doesn't mean that you don't have natural hazards and natural hazard impacts. So here's some examples of things that occurred within the last few years within McHenry County, but did not receive a presidential disaster declaration. So there was the 2017 Fox River flood that affected McHenry County when it rose nearly 3 feet above its flood stage. And then according to NOAA data, there have been 7 hail incidents, 3 structures damaged by lightning, and 23 severe storm and wind events since 2017. 2021 in particular seemed to be a big year for severe storms and wind, which caused trees and debris to fall and block roads, impact power lines, and even damage buildings and cars. And lastly, Northern Illinois just experienced a 2-year drought. McHenry County was certainly affected during this, and many communities implemented water conservation requirements. And although the drought is over now, it appears there are longer-term concerns for aquifer recharge and groundwater availability that could affect water resources moving forward. Next slide. All right, so validating natural hazards. The planning team used all of this collective information from the community profile, from the hazard profiles, from the surveys, to validate if we needed to change the natural hazard list from the 2017 update. So after comparing this 2017 list of hazards to the county's threats and hazards risk assessment from 2021, I believe, the planning team concluded to keep the hazard mitigation plan focused on natural hazards and to continue evaluating these 8 hazards as part of the planning effort. So moving forward, the hazards that we're going to be focusing on include flooding, severe summer storms, severe winter storms and extreme cold, tornadoes, extreme heat, drought and groundwater concerns, earthquakes, and dam failure. Next slide, please. So you're probably wondering, what do we do with all this information? How does it contribute to risk? How does this all work out? So what we do with all this research is we integrate this new knowledge into the existing risk assessment to validate if the risk has changed over the last 5 years. So specifically, what we are looking at are 3 criteria. One is vulnerability, which is really the susceptibility to negative impacts. And to me, I like to think of this as a condition. So, for example, your home, if you live in a floodplain, may or may not be vulnerable to the 100-year flood event, depending on how high it is elevated above grade. So that's an indicator of vulnerability. Then there's consequence, which are really the impacts that occur due to natural hazards, which can include damage to property, loss of critical services, or public health and safety concerns. And then lastly, there's the likelihood of occurrence, which is really the probability that a hazard will occur. So large scale damage events with high consequences are less likely to occur than a smaller scale event that might have reduced consequences. So incorporating this likelihood of occurrence normalizes the impacts that we evaluate for different hazards, because these hazards all occur on different scales. Does that make sense? I see Joanna nodding. Thank you. Next slide. All right, and so for this updated risk assessment, we did go through a scoring process to be able to quantify risk across McHenry County's 8 natural hazards. And we're not going to review this in detail, but essentially the team created definitions across each of those risk calculation categories: the vulnerability, the public health consequences, the consequences to property, so that the risk calculation is quantified and, again, comparable across different hazards. Next slide. So to supplement the scores, we also use FEMA's National Risk Index data, which was actually just updated a few weeks ago. So we're incorporating all of this brand new information from FEMA into the risk assessment. So FEMA produces this National Risk Index to support the local hazard mitigation planning processes. And using damage data and records from FEMA's disaster recovery and mitigation systems, FEMA actually provides a comparison of different counties' risks to identify the most hazard-prone areas in the nation. So as you can see here, FEMA has identified McHenry County as having relatively moderate risk, with moderate annual losses associated with natural hazards, especially compared to surrounding communities. And what, according to FEMA's data, is really driving this risk are tornadoes and extreme cold weather. So this isn't something that we completely rely on for the risk assessment, but again, it is a tool and it is information that we use in combination with all the research that's been done, all the feedback that we're getting from the survey, and from the expert knowledge from the McHenry County and its local jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So back in February, we met with the mitigation committee to review and discuss the risk assessment results and actually go through a score update process with the new data that's been collected, and sort of considering the history of natural hazards over the last 7 years or so. There was a really great turnout of over 40 representatives from the county, even despite an ice storm, believe it or not. So the rest of these slides, we're going to talk through the results of the mitigation committee's workshop, which really serve as the updated risk assessment for McHenry County. Next slide, please. All right. So in the workshop, we focused on the scores for vulnerability, for public health consequences, and property damage, and we asked for key insights from the mitigation committee. So based on the outcome of that workshop, all of the risk scores from the plan update increased. Now, this isn't because the risk has increased, it's more because of an update from the previous risk assessment methodology to a more current risk assessment methodology. However, this did result in some slight differences in the top hazards that threaten the county. So now the top 3 hazards and risks that are present include severe summer storms, which cover hail, high winds, and lightning. Flooding still is second place in terms of the greatest threats to the county from a natural hazard perspective. And then we have severe winter storms, which drop down a peg from the previous update, but are still in the top 3 natural hazard risks. Next slide, please. And here's some of the primary reasons for those risk updates for the hazards that are really changing significantly. So for severe summer storms, there are really few mitigation measures in place to prevent impacts from those high winds and from hail, especially in older neighborhoods. Newer neighborhoods do have updated building codes that provide protection to homes, but consequence scores. Oh, does someone have a question?
I guess in one of the 4.2.4
Looks like we've got a hot mic. Just a quick reminder, folks, to please keep your Go ahead,
All
Kelly.
right, I'm gonna keep going. So for severe summer storms, those consequence scores actually increase due to more large outdoor events that are being planned in the county because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we did take into account that there is more exposure from that perspective. Then for flooding, the major damage that was caused in 2017 from the Fox River flood, including impacts to home and infrastructure, increased the consequence scores there. In addition, these new scores take into account that the southeastern portion of the county really has the most exposure due to the population's proximity to the river. And then lastly, tornadoes are something that, continue to be a threat to the county. And according to the National Weather Service, tornado occurrence is increasing in Illinois. And the county has, heard from the public that the warning system could use some improvement. So that's something that we also take into account in the risk assessment. And then lastly, there's drought. So the recent experience with prolonged drought has increased that consequence score. And in addition, we want to reflect the fact that agricultural losses are expected, even though they are usually reimbursed through small business assistance loans. Still want to take into account that there is a loss occurring there. All right, next slide, please. So also during the workshop, we went through a exercise to identify key critical infrastructure that multiple communities are dependent on in McHenry County. So just briefly, here are some examples of what we heard. So for government type critical facilities, fire stations and police departments are something that are critical countywide, and they all back up and support each other. So they are very important to consider as we move into the mitigation strategy. From a medical perspective, want to make sure that we are protecting hospitals, dialysis centers, and urgent care sites throughout the county. From a transportation perspective, the mitigation committee flagged Route 31, Route 14, and the Route 14 Bridge, the Union Prairie Railroad, and Queen Anne Road and Bull Valley Road infrastructure as some of the critical and most relied upon transportation routes within the county that we want to make sure, again, are protected and considered in the mitigation strategy. And then for utilities, water and wastewater infrastructure is super critical. And again, when you think about systems like these, and when one section of the system is disrupted, that usually does affect other components of the system. So we want to make sure that we are covering sort of system-based mitigation in the mitigation strategy as well. We also covered community resources. So those areas within the community that really contribute to community resilience, provide gathering places, are areas where people share information, are also important to protect. So things like community centers, park spaces, libraries, want to make sure that those are being protected too in the mitigation strategy. Next slide, please, Justin. And then lastly, we wrapped up the risk assessment workshop with a quick brainstorm of some mitigation actions, which we wanted to share here with the group today. So just to give folks a little bit of a sneak peek into what next month's presentation is going to be regarding the mitigation strategy, here's some examples of what McHenry County is considering as we are updating those goals, objectives, and actions. So a flooding perspective, we're looking at projects such as stream maintenance and restoration, more floodplain buyouts, managing that open space for water collection, and even from a activity or a policy perspective, improving code enforcement, improving building codes to meet higher standards. For protection against summer storms, we're looking at utility grid modernization and retrofits, so making sure that the power grid is strong. We're looking at roadway elevation and drainage projects to make sure that those critical transportation routes remain available immediately after a storm event. For tornadoes, the county has already been considering safe rooms. There have been some that have been constructed throughout the county since the last mitigation plan update, but it's still something that the county wants to consider, continue considering in their mitigation strategy. And then for winter storms, there were a lot of education related actions that folks throughout the county thought would be useful for the strategy moving forward. So educational campaigns about, where shelters exist, increasing the accessibility of those shelters, maintaining vegetation and how to do that, in addition to having tabletop exercises with the county and all of its jurisdictions to better account for, having to work together to solve problems when winter storms arrive. From an extreme heat perspective, we are looking at having designated cooling shelters, potentially even exploring mobile cooling vehicles, in addition to investing in sustainable backup power resources for the community. So again, thinking about redundant power if the grid is impacted by an event. So looking and making sure that that redundant power source is sustainable. So looking at solar farms, at microgrids. And then from a drought perspective, there's a lot here. There's a lot from the Water Resources Action Plan. And so we're sort of considering all of the actions that are identified there as best practices to also incorporate in the mitigation plan for that really great plan alignment. And with that, that concludes our presentation. So really, we are looking for feedback on any of these items. As Justin mentioned, we have time to collect questions and comments and address these on the phone. If you need a little bit of extra time to soak in the information that was presented, I do believe that we'll be posting this recording and the slide deck on the county's website. And you can absolutely reach out to the county EMA or folks at ICF for any additional questions you have.
Thanks, Kelly. One thing I thought that was really interesting was that even through our quantitative analysis of the risks, the new top hazards ended up being the 3 top hazards from the survey, right? So in this instance, perception really does equal reality. I thought that was really interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So as Kelly mentioned, now is the time. If you have questions, feel free to pop those in the chat. If you have comments, again, feel free to pop those in the chat. And then feel free, if you'd like to ask your question, feel free to raise your hands and we'll unmute you or call on you rather. And if you have a comment you'd like to say verbally, feel free to raise your hand as well. So we'll give folks a couple of minutes. And while folks are thinking, we'll go ahead and take a look at what we're seeing in the chat. So Cindy, I think it's critical that the topic of aquifer recharge be included as a key issue under drought. Thank you very much for that, Cindy, rather. Kurt, so there's no mention of upgrading communications in the western part of the county. Wi-Fi, even phone service in this area is horrible. It looks like the only option is satellite access. Even Verizon and T-Mobile do not offer service in my area. Thank you for that feedback, Kurt. I know, just to kind of look behind the curtain in the mitigation strategy, public information as well as enhancing service area is definitely something that we're prioritizing and looking at just based on the survey feedback, in addition to some of what we found through our plan research. But really appreciate that, Kurt. All right, Mark, can you clarify if the projects we identified will be included in the plan, and how will funding be requested and approved for these projects? So great question, Mark. I can answer the first one first. It is actually required as part of this plan to identify potential funding solutions for our mitigation strategy. So in that instance, absolutely. For every action that we're recommending, we are also recommending a potential funding source for those actions. And then to your first question, can you clarify if the projects we identified will be included in the plan? Mark, my assumption is you're mentioning the projects that we just mentioned, that we solicited as part of the committee. Just confirming that those are the projects you're mentioning. And we'll give you a second to respond. But all that to say, yes, we're looking at where we're seeing a preponderance of obviously risk, and then matching that risk to the projects that were identified by the committee, as well as some of the projects from the previous plan that we may have just not had an opportunity to get started. So in that instance, absolutely. And then yes, Mark, the ones that you submitted, we certainly are considering along with all of the other projects. Again, the backlog that exist in the county, as well as some of the new ideas. So every project idea that we received, we're considering as a potential mitigation solution, as long as again they really tackle those risks that were popping as high priority. But thank you for that feedback. All right, Patrick, I see your comment here. Kelly just talked about the mitigation strategies for the identified hazards. Emergency alert assessments was included as a strategy for summer storms. We're exploring options to replace our village's emergency alert system. So it is possible funding opportunities would become available after the plan is finalized. Yes, yes, Patrick, to your point. As long as and I can tell you with full confidence, we've actually got this documented in the update to the plan to make it even simpler to reference when you are applying or do decide to apply for federal or state assistance. So all that to say, it is within the purview of the plan and definitely something that we're prioritizing. So absolutely. All right, and Mary, protection of sensitive aquifer recharge areas per the SARA map, per Cindy's comment. Yes, Mary, we've got the SARA map, and it was something that we're including as part of our risk assessment. All right, not seeing any hands go up, which is completely fine. I'm sure folks are still thinking. So we're gonna give folks just another couple minutes to ask some questions or provide some comments. I think one thing just for folks on the line, was there anything that you heard today that surprised you? I think we'd be really interested to hear some feedback. Was there any information that either I shared as part of the survey or Kelly shared either as part of the FEMA process or the risk assessment that surprised folks? Or if it didn't surprise you, was there anything that was very new that you heard today? Okay. And then finally, are there things that folks want to hear more about regarding natural hazards mitigation or preparedness, right? So really curious if there are other natural hazard specific topics that folks are really interested in diving in more, that potentially the county can push more information out about or use additional venues like this to share. All right, seeing a couple comments here. So from Cindy, from the FEMA requirements, a policy of resilient, sustainable communities should be the priority of the plan, as they are an investment in reducing risk. Absolutely, what happens at the local level is ultimately the most important. We need to think holistically. Eligible projects such as stormwater improvement, stream restoration, not be focused just on better drainage, should focus on reconnecting floodplains and restoring wetlands that hold water and allow for it to soak into the ground. Absolutely. Nature-based solutions are, I know, the preferred solution. I know of at least FEMA and the federal government. Holistic solutions that address both the flooding and aquifer recharge issue is critical to our water supply. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that feedback, Cindy. And then for Kurt, a lot of hoops to jump through in regards to floodplain construction and mitigation when it's seemingly scored so low on the risk assessment. Yes, anything, any type of compliance work is certainly going to have a lot of requirements and criteria. But yeah, really all I can say about that, Kurt, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can hop in here, Justin. So, Kurt, regarding your question, so There are actually federal development requirements in the floodplain that are really separate from the county's natural hazard risk assessment and what gets incorporated there. However, what we do take into account is where there are new construction and higher standards in the floodplain that might reduce a community's vulnerability. So that is actually, I think, some of the reason why the scoring is maybe a little bit lower for flooding than other natural hazards. However, it is still second, so it is still presenting quite a risk to the county that we want to make sure we address in the mitigation strategy. Any other questions? Oh,
Can
go
I ask a
ahead.
question? Yeah, this is
Sure,
Kurt.
Kurt.
So, like in our situation, most of Union is in a floodplain. And we were contemplating putting addition on, and there's all of these requirements associated with it because, if there is a 100-year flood, it could conceivably surpass the capacity of this underground pipe that is supposed to convey it off to the Kish. So I'm just surprised there's not more focus on that kind of thing. With, if that's such, it either is a concern or it isn't a concern, it seems to me. And there doesn't seem to be maybe a lot of connection between the two things. Am I making any sense? I don't know.
I think so. And some of this might be, the particular floodplain management regulations that are present in Union. So for example, there's the 50% threshold requirement. So if you're putting on an addition and that addition is worth more than half of the current value of your property, that's another, sort of hoop to jump through, right? You have to make sure your entire structure is compliant with floodplain regulations. And drainage and, things that are, managed underground are absolutely part of that consideration. So that could be something that I would check with your local development review team to get more specifics on how floodplain management regulations might be affecting permit reviews on that.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting to is the lack of mitigation controls have basically stymied any sort of development or growth that can happen in the village. And if the water was routed elsewhere or there were safeguards put into place that could make it more, I'm not talking about, creating a flooding hazard, but it would seem like there would be ways of mitigating it, that are often used in other places. But I think the village's problem is they just don't have a lot of money to do any of that kind of stuff. So here we all sit with septics, I might add. So that's an interesting situation too.
Yeah, and that's a challenge I think a lot of communities are seeing, kind of a lack of funding, a lack of capacity to tackle multiple challenges and be able to address multiple problems, right? Like, I think if you're thinking about addressing hazard mitigation through multiple levels of defense where you're protecting property, you're elevating individual structures, but you're also addressing drainage. That's an ideal hazard mitigation approach, right? But there are capacity challenges on that end. So hopefully that's where this plan will help, is continuing to unlock funding for the community to pursue to address those issues.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
Yeah, thanks
And
for
I
your
guess
comments.
one thing to add, Kurt, is we did take a look at the facility expansion assessment as part of our review, and so the effort was included or is being included in the plan. So it again will make hopefully a simpler effort to procure potential state and federal funding as a result of it being in there and aligning to advancing goals of the plan, et cetera. So it's documented, so hopefully that can help unlock some pathways to some additional funding for you guys. All right. Let's see, Mark, to this point of priority, is there an opportunity for the village to prioritize with county decision makers? So I think to that point, Mark, this is the venue, right? This is certainly a good opportunity to raise that flag to the county. Obviously, the historical society and the village have already raised this particular challenge, but this ensures that these needs make their way and are documented in this plan and codified in this plan, which should ultimately to the point I just made to Kurt, help unlock some funding streams. So regardless, even if it's not a county-wide effort, right? Even if it's only localized to one particular municipality or one township, it's still there and it'd still be a good reference when applying for state or federal funds. All right. I see we are at 2 o'clock. I want to make one final call for any last minute questions, concerns, or sorry, questions or comments rather, about today's presentations or some of the discussion we've been having. Let's see, Vinny, I see you your comment. You have to see development in buildings in 2 scopes. Yeah, absolutely. There are mitigations in place, but if development doesn't want a construction basin with hard storm sewers to mitigate, the natural lateral transfer, shear, and open ditch and culverts with slope pitch takes larger scopes of land. Yeah, absolutely. So a really good point. All right. With that, really quickly, just want to kick things over to County EMA to see if they have any comments based on some of the conversation we've been having.
No, all good. We appreciate all the input. The one thing I'm pretty sure Justin was gonna mention, if I don't, if you have not already, done a, participation, a letter of, participation, please send those in. And that way we can start tracking, hours for that and get you in as part of the plan. We don't want to miss out on a community, a jurisdiction, not being able to hopefully utilize this plan and possibly funding down the road after the plan is adopted.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Bob. So in addition to that, again, if you're participating from a township or unincorporated community and want to get involved in the process, please let us know in the chat or shoot a note to EMA at mchenrycountyil.gov. And again, just to foot stomp Bob's point, if you're a member or a representative of the mitigation committee that has not yet filled out a letter of support, please drop your email in the chat now and we'll send you a blank form. Or just reach out to the EMA email address and we'll send you one. Want to definitely make sure you get credit for participating so that you are eligible for these FEMA funds. All right. With that, just a couple of next steps before we let everyone go. For the mitigation committee members that are with us today, the ICF team is going to be reaching out over the coming weeks to fill some data gaps and validate some information we have. Things like building code scores. That was just top of mind, but there's plenty. There's several others that we're going to reach out just to confirm. Then for everybody, our next public meeting is going to be is tentatively scheduled for Thursday, May 25th. And we're going to present and collect feedback on the county's mitigation strategy. May look at doing this a little bit earlier over the lunch break, so maybe hopefully some more folks can join us. But we'll send out some communications around that. Don't worry. And then reminder, we're gonna be wrapping up the plan update and hopefully submitting to the Illinois Emergency Management Agency for review in early June. To Kelly's point earlier, so we can make sure that the county and any participating municipalities, townships, incorporated areas are eligible to apply for some of these FEMA funds. Last but not least, if you have any remaining questions or comments regarding today's presentation, please email them to ema@mchenrycountyil.gov. Just a reminder, and I saw that our colleague Cassidy posted the EMA website in the chat. Thank you so much. That's where we're going to post these slides as well as notes. So some of the Q&A that we received today. We'll post there. You can also go there and see the slides and notes and outputs from the last 5 or 6 months of meetings as well. So that'll be a great resource for folks. All right, with that, and on behalf of the ICF team and the county, just want to say thank you so much, everyone, for participating. I know it was a lot of information, but excellent discussion, and we look forward to seeing everyone next month. So everyone have a great afternoon, be safe, be well, and we'll see you in May. All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.